Welcome. This is Paul Moen, and this is The Evangelist. And for those that are listening in, I'm here together with my good friend, Rafael Garcia. Welcome, Raf.
Hi, Paul.
And we've worked together over many years and had lots of challenges in the realm of evangelism. And in particular, one of our big jobs together was implementing evangelism explosion in the life of the local church. And these were churches that we were involved in terms of church planting. And we enjoyed quite a few good years, very fruitful, working together. And we're here talking I believe in this particular discussion about the impact of evangelism explosion on the life of the local church and its effect. We're talking about an area of interest and study which I think at a theological school level has been neglected, called ecclesiology. And it's the life and nature and the design of the local church. I could mention this, that it seems that on the basis of cooperation, of propagating the gospel, the Protestant churches have thought, well, it doesn't... When we're talking about the church, they were simply thinking in terms of government. The governmental structures don't matter. And to narrow ecclesiology to simply the governmental structures is a real pity. And in fact, the tension I've felt over the years, having been trained in the ministry for pastoral ministry, as a pastor in a local church, often the emphasis was on care, and that government, well, was basically in a traditional way talk about eldership or bishops or other leadership by gifting, but the church itself wasn't really discussed. I think when you introduce the tension of the biblical account, which really has an emphasis more, it has the added emphasis, not just of care of its people, but the equipping of its people, its mending of its people, its enabling of its people to advance the kingdom of God, to advance the purposes of Christ, and to advance the gospel.
Yeah.
You see a big challenge. It really shakes you up.
It is, and it was.
Yeah.
And, this was the point of a discussion, I remember, that went along the lines of, we've had many people profess faith, through the training program or in evangelism as a way of life.
Yep.
But then how was it that these people could become part of the fellowship of the church?
Yeah.
How would that happen? How could that happen? And it, along with, I would say, in the sovereignty of God, a sort of creaking of the existing church structure, and it not working as well as what people thought it might, that this was, as you say, creating a tension and creating a, not a crisis, but a real questioning of what was going on, and could something be done to make it easier and friendlier and more meaningful for people who had professed faith to then say, we want to join this congregation, we want to join this community.
Yeah. So and this is obviously difficult, but necessary. It's a necessary push that I think you and I received together with this purpose in mind of advancing the kingdom of God, of seeing more people respond to the good news of the gospel of Christ. Yeah. And how can we be inclusive of those new people? And I think From a philosophical point of view, they talk about ontology. Ontology is first things about what is it. And the question of, well, what is the church then?
Yeah.
And if you boil down to its main components, I can remember at Bible college doing an exercise of, if there were only 4 or 5 things that you could have, what are those 5 things that you would deem necessary to have church? And, it was a great thing because church life can be very complicated nowadays.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you lose the trees because of the forest. And, boiling it down, what is the church? And I still remember you and I discussing the book by Kevin Giles. He's an Anglican theologian based in Victoria. What on earth is the church?
Yeah.
And the missionary effort and the advancing of the gospel creates questions about the very nature of what you're doing as a church. Because here we were church planters. And, well, what's a church? Well, you'd think you'd know, but actually, obviously, it sometimes degenerates to, what's a church? Well, it's a certain group of people that meet at a certain time, usually on a Sunday morning, at a certain place, doing certain religious activities.
Yes.
And it's narrowed to the Sunday meeting.
Yes.
It's narrowed to the congregation.
And the other part to that was when people had made a profession of faith, it was then what's next for them? What's the next thing they need to know or learn or hear?
Yeah.
And we knew this from the outline because it gave you steps about follow-up.
Yeah.
And,
the Bible, prayer, fellowship, worship. If you were a Pentecostal, it was always tithing. Was part of the follow through.
Yeah, and then it was invitation to church.
Yes.
And so that at that juncture, there was this thing of, well, we can't. They can come to church, but they'll just sit there on a Sunday morning, and we knew from our own personal experience that we had come to the place where we were in our lives at that point because we had gone on with something. Someone had taken an interest in us. Someone had laid down some foundations for us. And so this interface between profession of faith and being in the church and then what would happen in the church was really important because all the, promise could evaporate.
Yes.
By seeing this person in the meeting, but then not having anything else to do with them really apart from, hi, how are you? How's it going? And
agreeing with whatever was spoken publicly in front of them on the day.
That's right.
Yeah.
So the connection was tenuous.
Yes.
At the point of church.
Yeah. So Eddie Gibbs wrote a book in Name Only, and he talks about nominalism.
Yeah.
And nominalism is the enemy of, if you have a church that is riddled with nominalism, which I believe, broadly speaking, we struggle with right across the Western culture, a consumerist attitude toward the service suppliers, supplying religious services to consumers. And they're in name only, are they Christian? And yet here we are, we've been propagating the gospel, challenging people to surrender their lives to this message and to participate.
Yeah.
Fellowship as a participation.
Yeah.
Well, what opportunities are we giving people to participate?
And it was quite obvious. I mean, when you look at the textbook, Matthew 28 is quoted.
Right.
Make disciples.
Yes.
And so, at one level we knew that we just didn't want people to profess faith, but we wanted them to go on and be disciples of Jesus.
Yeah. Win a disciple to make a disciple.
Yeah. And in other words, as another illustration from the textbook. Catch a man a fish, you feed him, but if you teach him how to fish, he can feed himself and others. And so we were very aware of that.
Yeah. You mentioned in a previous discussion just beforehand about how the Reformation, it did put the Bible into the hands of people, and the idea of the Second Reformation. There's a book by Bill Beckham who talks about not just putting the Bible into the hands of people, but putting the ministry into the hands of people. And in the sense of the priestly role is for everyone. And so now we have a whole room full of priests we're helping to develop.
Yeah.
It takes on a whole different picture.
Yes.
Then I just have a congregation here of people listening to my great message.
Yes.
Church takes on a whole different kind of texture.
Yes.
Quite a big, challenging texture. There's various metaphors that they use about the church. And, I think I got a few of these from different sources. I think Peter Corney in Melbourne is another guy who's spoken about this. The church is a hospital, and it's valid for people to experience the healing power of Christ in the life of the community. That the church is, to a certain degree, a hospital. Progressively, as we take responsibility, say, in our own household as a family member, the church is like a family. I used to talk to my kids saying, this is not a restaurant, this is the family home. So let's wash up the dishes together. There's family responsibilities you learn within the life of the church. But then there's more than that. Often church is like a school. And, many churches pride themselves on very good quality teaching. And I don't despise that at all. But I do think there's an element of challenge that comes when you introduce evangelism explosion into the life of the church. And that is the church as an army. In the sense of there's elements of church life where we're mobilized.
And disciplined.
And this is one of the marks of a true church. It's not just the gospel preached or the sacraments administered properly, but it's also discipline that's added into the life of the people. They become disciples. And army life is a bit more like that. Now, I don't know what your experience of that is over the years with EE, the army life, how you experience that.
Look, I would say it's really a metaphor. I don't think evangelism explosion is like a army necessarily, but there is training, there is discipline, there is formation, and I think as a metaphor goes, it goes some way, but probably not helpful in a modern way as the way we think about the military now, or the army now.
In an abusive sense.
In an abusive sense, that's right.
Yeah.
But as far as being formed and trained and disciplined, these are qualities or characteristics that being in the evangelism explosion training course or running it or put, for the benefit of the people, those qualities are needed and are expected.
And you see that in the Gospels in terms of Jesus with his disciples.
Yeah.
He disciplines them. He has expectations of them. He's training them.
They undergo instruction.
They're undergoing instruction.
They undergo field testing.
Yeah, they're submitting their life to him in daily activity. They leave their nets and go.
Yeah.
So
he sends them out 2 by 2.
2 by 2. And so I think there's a challenge too in terms of the character of a soldier, which I think are things you can draw upon. And Kennedy does use this a lot. Being an American, I think there's less anxiety about the term army for church there. And interesting, anyone could explore William Booth and the Salvation Army in terms of the rigour with which they would embark on mission work, 150 years ago, especially in Britain. But there's a certain courage or boldness required in instigating conversations of deep meaning and going where few men have gone before into the hearts and lives and souls of other human beings. Which, if you're going to do effective evangelism, you're plunging into people's lives.
Yeah.
And you need to do that with care, caution, consideration, and a certain amount of skill.
That's right.
I often equate a good evangelist as a good heart surgeon. And, dare you open up the heart of a person, as a physical heart surgeon? Well, you want to undergo some very thorough training. And the challenge for someone to engage in someone's life in a deep and meaningful way, and to, engage in that process requires some good quality training. And I think that's why I like Evangelism Explosion. It's the best that's on offer. It's not perfect, but it certainly offers that. I think I often remember this illustration of James Kennedy, where he talks about, and this is it's a complimentary thing to, I need to be a heart surgeon. That's a high demand. But he uses the illustration of the blind Korean leper. And when anyone would walk past him, he would sit up in his bed and he would take the stump of a hand where he'd lost his fingers, and blindly with his eyes, he'd just point to the sky, pointing with his arm and his hand in an attempt to witness that, to believe in God, and he was pointing to Christ. And this is simple yet powerful illustration that you don't have to be the expert.
No.
But you are meant to be courageous to point the way in one way or another, as God gives you grace.
And do what you're able to do.
Do what you're able to do, not what you're not able to do.
Yeah.
And we want to enable people
to
be more effective as better witnesses. So, and I think in that's an easy segue then to the power of the Spirit. You shall be my witnesses when the power of the Spirit comes upon you. And I think if you're going to have a missionary church, and Luke Acts, it's definitely those two books. Luke, in writing them, he's got a special thing in mind in terms of advocating the power of the Spirit in the loosing of the tongue.
Yes.
To speak.
And I would say in terms of the we call it acts, but actually in the Greek the word means it's praxis, it's practice.
Yeah.
So it's not the acts of the apostles, but more so the practice of the apostles.
What they did.
And it is a role model or a modelling of how we should practice our faith.
Yes, a missionary practice.
A missionary practice.
Yes, very good. And I think those things need to be kept in mind. And Evangelism Explosion helps us to do that. Now, we had our challenges. So the challenge that seemed to be introduced when Evangelism Explosion was taken seriously and implemented in the life of the local church. The thing that challenged me was how I was using my time and the energy, the limited resources I had. And so much of it was put into this entertaining, beautiful, well-researched event of which people came and passively participated in. There were a few pretty active, busy musicians, perhaps, or the speaker themselves, or some administrative tasks to be done to get the event up. But as far as discipleship and development of individual people, the church needed to take a whole new direction. And I was very frustrated and unhappy.
And it was simply that those who were doing those tasks were generally those who were more mature in their faith and were robbed of time to fellowship with other members of the church who would benefit from that interaction. And I think that was one of the questions that I went to Fort Lauderdale with in my mind at the time. And I was very keen to chat to members of the ministry staff there, and one of them I spoke to was the minister responsible for follow-up. And it was at that point he chatted to me, or I collared him really. I arranged an appointment with him. But I wanted to find out what they were doing. You know, how was it that they were including new members, incorporating them into the life of the church. And he mentioned Ralph Neighbour. Where Do We Go From Here? As a book that they had been reading in that church. And it was then that when I came back and we had a discussion about this very issue, that we noticed that in the On Being magazine there was a conference at which Ralph Neighbour was going to speak about cell churches, or basic Christian, basic Christian communities, basically.
And so we then, harping back to someone like Paul Yonggi Cho, how can he have such a large church? How could that be? Is that possible? Well, it wasn't built on his entertaining preaching so much as the structure of the church, where he gave everyone the chance to love one another, to care for one another, to teach one another. And in the small group settings, it was a multiplying of the pastoral role.
That's right. And even having communion in those small groups.
So that led us on. I still remember reading a book by Martin Robinson called The Faith of the Unbeliever. And somehow I had to release the membership of our church, those that we knew had an ongoing loving relationship with Christ, to liberate them to engage meaningfully and to share their life with the outsiders, and to engage with outsiders, obviously in terms of through EE with the gospel, but to engage meaningfully with sharing their life. I think of 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, where Paul says, I was happy not to just share the gospel, but my very life. Just as a father would, look after his children, or a mother would nurse her children. So we needed to become a community that looked after one another. And it wasn't the pastor looking after everyone. It was getting the one another's operating.
The one another's. And in that sense, I suppose you could say that one of the impacts of evangelism explosion on the life of the church was to bring it to a point through the sovereignty of God to have a more honest accounting of the spiritual health of the church, of where it was at, and to more closely realign the activities of the members to a more biblical model, and
Yeah.
not dissipate energy into what was thought to be the way to be a church, but actually to realign it to a more New Testament model of being the church.
Are we consistent with the practice of the early church?
Yeah, of
the
early
acts,
church, the acts.
Of the apostles. And so this, one holy Catholic and apostolic church. Are we an apostolic church following these things? So these were all, I think, extremely important and very healthy challenges. But I think even James Kennedy warned that when you introduce this challenge, that it'll either change the church for good or it'll smash it apart. And I think we've had elements of that in our experience, haven't we?
Yeah, it's both things.
And it certainly smashed any naivety I have about church life in terms of some of the things that people do that you think, well, what is going to be the value of this?
Yeah.
I've kind of become a little more cynical, I think, about some of the fads in church life.
Yes, which, we've heard about. Certainly Ralph Neighbour spoke from his experience about that. And, Paul, I don't think I would swap any of this learning that I've received as a result of, all those years ago being trained. That it's led to very rich.
One of the other challenges I thought was really significant, which you yourself were very good at, I felt, was contact management. Like, there's the database software, which was, very important in terms of trying to keep track of contacts. But it was not only a challenge at the church level administratively about keeping track of people. I can remember we had a database list. There was about 200 people that had made professions of faith at that time, and serious professions of faith. And we were a small church of, basically 50 adults. But we had 200 people that made professions, happy to say yes to Christ through the EE training. But how do you include them? But then we had 400 other people in the queue interested, willing to talk some more, that gave us their phone number, address. So I had 600 people that we were managing just through the formal ministry of Evangelism Explosion. But then the challenge really for the life of the church was everyone was meant to be keeping track of all their relationships in terms of whether they were being good stewards of their time, they were influencing people constructively. And I always found that one of the biggest challenges. Now, tell me your experience when we took a team, had all been trained in Evangelism Explosion, to a Scripture Union family mission. And I think there were like 43 professions of faith.
Well, there was a lot.
Yeah.
There was a lot. People, contrary to what you might fear, in that context, people were happy to speak to you and, just sharing your faith with them naturally. There's no sort of untoward pressure or anything, but just sharing what you believe. People came to see miraculously at that time and on that beach mission, that they wanted to trust Christ.
But you were involved also in the follow-up.
Yes.
So you kept track of those contacts.
Yeah. Look, it's an interesting process, and it's almost like people can profess to want to trust Christ, but time is a great tester, and over time, I just remember this one person just seemed to stick with me
Yeah.
as much as I tried to stick with them. And eventually I was able to follow them up and found that they lived near the church that I had belonged to prior to going to be at Christian City Church Macarthur, and I was able to follow them up and introduce them to my old church.
Right.
And as far as I know, they're still there.
And from what I remember, of the 43 professions, 18 of them were still attending a church, a local church, 6 months later.
Wow.
I can still remember this stat coming through.
Yeah.
And, it's a testimony to your hard work that, it wasn't just to fly in, fly out, go to beach mission and forget it.
Yeah.
And this was part of the things we had learned in terms of proper follow through and follow up. These are things that if you follow the model,
Yeah.
if you stick to the model, you won't allow yourself to become flaky
Yeah.
in your efforts.
I think that's really
Diligent.
important in terms of integrity.
Yeah, integrity.
That if you see them as part of your new family,
Yeah,
then you will make every effort to connect them.
yeah. I think when we worked together doing the mobile clinic, we came across a group of Christians in this particular community, the Christian community, some of whom had come from Hong Kong. And they told this great story about how they, in their career, which was very important to them and obviously to their family, they would take a job working, and they were all part of the same Christian community, but they'd all target a particular company. They'd all apply for the certain jobs. They'd work there for 2 years, and having gone through the whole business, the building, once they'd seen who they could influence for good, after 2 years, they would then apply to get a transfer to another company and would do the same thing, apply of their witness. And I just thought,
Amazing.
I can imagine that in terms of some of the very passionate
Yeah.
Hong Kong Chinese people in the church.
Yeah.
And that's something that came through my EE contacts. I thought it was a fantastic thing. I think there's also a couple more challenges with the implementation in the local church. It's finding faithful people that you can invest your time in.
Yes.
Now, for you, I've never regretted spending any moment with you in terms of the time and energy
That's very kind.
to invest.
Yeah.
It's an investment. But finding people that are willing to receive from you, that you can give yourself generously to, is not all that easy.
It's not all that easy, and also, time can be an issue, and it's not only do you need to want to spend time, but as you're saying, they need
Reciprocate.
to reciprocate, and that is part of fellowship. There's no doubt about that.
And it's developing a friendship where there's mutual
giving and taking.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
receiving.
and I clearly remember that. There was a member of our church, and I know that you had led him in a profession of faith and had brought him into the church, and he had received us warmly. And I remember doing sort of like a new believers course with them, and I had it in my mind that I was going to be teaching them all this stuff from this booklet or this course, and they would just download it. And actually what I found during that time, it didn't go as quickly as what I thought it would, but actually I found myself on the receiving end from them.
Yeah.
And I really do think that was, it was a very important lesson that you don't go there to mold someone. You go there to fellowship, and you both mold each other.
Yeah. It's mutual receiving
Yeah.
from God. Well, I think we'll close it up there. Thanks, Rafael, for being with me today, and it's the evangelist.
Thanks, Paul, for having me.
And I really, I think this will be the beginning of many other podcasts we'll do together.
All right. Thank you.
Any discussions?
Okay.
Thanks.